You won't believe what happened when a plane crashed right on my property, and how my HOA president decided it was the perfect opportunity to make my life a living nightmare. Instead of helping, she locked my gate and blocked the emergency responders like some kind of neighborhood dictator on a power trip. Spoiler alert, she didn't know who she was messing with. Let's just say I wasn't about to let a Karen in a suit push me around. This story's about to get wild, and trust me, you'll want to know how it all unfolds. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's about to get juicy. The quiet of a regular Tuesday was shattered by a deafening roar. A Cessna crashed into my back pasture, smoke rising from the wreckage. Before I could even process the chaos, Vivian appeared, locking the gate and blocking the rescue team's access. She came storming across my front yard in her perfectly pressed blazer and matching pants, clutching a clipboard like it was some kind of holy scripture. "Dylan Hawk," she announced in that shrill voice that could strip paint off a barn, "you are in direct violation of Meadowbrook Heights community standards. This crash has created an unsafe environment, and as chairwoman of the Homeowners Association, I am implementing emergency protocols." Before I could even explain who I was, Deputy White House, Chief of Staff for National Security Affairs. She marched over to my front gate, the only way emergency vehicles could access my property, and snapped a heavy-duty padlock right through the chain. The fire department truck was pulling up to my driveway just as she clicked that lock shut, and I watched the captain's face go from concern to pure bewilderment. The fire captain called for immediate access, but Vivian waved him off, declaring, "This is now under HOA emergency management. No one enters without proper documentation." The captain looked at me like I had three heads, probably wondering what kind of lunatic would block emergency responders from a plane crash. I opened my mouth to explain that I wasn't just any property owner. I had direct authority from the president to oversee critical incidents involving federal aircraft, but no words came out. The weight of the situation pressed down on me. How had it come to this? I wasn't just fighting Vivian anymore, I was fighting an entire neighborhood that seemed to be buying into her lies. And the worst part, I was starting to feel like I was losing control of everything. Maybe I had no choice but to play this game her way. Her voice, cold and clipped, betrayed a past where manipulation and control had been her only means of survival. "I am the chairwoman of the HOA," she said in her commanding tone, "and I'm reporting that Mr. Hawk is obstructing emergency response efforts. He's creating a public safety hazard by blocking access. This wasn't just about the crash, it was a fight for power. She needed to prove that she was the one in control, no matter the cost. What she didn't realize was that I had spent the last 7 years managing national security crises from the White House Situation Room. This was hardly my first rodeo with power struggles. 2 patrol cars showed up within 10 minutes, and suddenly I found myself in handcuffs in my own driveway, while smoke continued to rise from the wreckage behind my house. The officer asked why I locked the gate, but no matter how I explained Vivian had the key, he seemed to doubt me. I could see Vivian standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed, wearing this satisfied smirk that made my blood boil. She had positioned herself where all the neighbors could see her, playing the role of the concerned citizen who had bravely stood up to the dangerous property owner. The fire department had to call in a bolt cutter to get through my own gate, which meant precious minutes were wasted while the plane continued to smolder in my back field. I tried to tell the officers about my position in the White House and that the crash plane potentially contained sensitive government information, but they were skeptical without my credentials, which were locked inside my house. My secure phone was also inside, preventing me from contacting the White House Situation Room or the president directly. The whole scene felt like something out of a fever dream. Here I was getting arrested on my own property while a plane burned behind my house, all because some power-hungry HOA president decided to make a statement. As they loaded me into the back of the patrol car, I caught Vivian's eye through the window. She gave me a little wave, still clutching that clipboard, and I swear I could see her mouthing the words, "Know your place." The worst part was watching my neighbors start to gather along the street, whispering and pointing, like I was some kind of criminal mastermind, instead of a high-ranking federal official trying to address a national security incident. Reed Dalton, my neighbor to the west, looked genuinely confused by the whole situation, but most of the others seemed to be buying into Vivian's narrative without question. At the police station, they had me cooling my heels in an interview room for about 2 hours before Detective Martinez finally came in with a folder. "Mr. Hawk," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "we've reviewed the security footage from your property, and it's pretty clear you didn't lock that gate." She slid a photograph across the table, showing Vivian approaching my gate with the padlock already in her possession, checking her watch like she was timing her arrival, and then deliberately securing the gate just minutes before the fire department arrived. "We're releasing you with an apology, but I have to ask, what's the deal with your HOA president?" I took a deep breath and handed her my government ID. "Detective, I'm the Deputy White House Chief of Staff for National Security Affairs. That plane contains sensitive equipment that requires immediate federal attention. I purchased this ranch as a weekend retreat 3 years ago, but never joined the HOA. Vivian has been looking for any excuse to flex her authority, and apparently, a plane crash was just the opportunity she'd been waiting for." The detective's eyes widened as she examined my credentials. "I'll arrange for an immediate escort back to your property, sir, and I'll personally ensure no one interferes with the federal investigation." When I finally got back to my property that evening, Reed was waiting for me by the gate with a cup of coffee and a grim expression. "Dylan, you need to know what you're up against," he said, handing me the mug. "Vivienne pulled the same stunt 2 years ago when the Martinez family had a kitchen fire. She convinced the HOA board that their smoke damage was a neighborhood hazard and tried to get them evicted. Reed, a retired firefighter, warned me, Vivian's not just power-hungry, she's vindictive. She won't stop until she gets what she wants." As we stood there watching the last wisps of smoke rise from the crash site, I realized this was just the beginning of what was going to be a very long fight, one that now had national security implications I couldn't fully disclose, even to Reed. The next morning brought a whole new level of insanity, courtesy of the National Transportation Safety Board and my own federal security team. Agent Isla Brooks, from the NTSB, arrived at my gate bright and early, clipboard in hand and determination in her eyes, accompanied by 2 members of my White House security detail whom I'd finally managed to contact. They were all met by what looked like a miniature version of the Berlin Wall across my driveway, orange construction cones, yellow caution tape, and official-looking signs declaring Zardos area no unsoftened personnel blocked every possible entrance to my property. Vivian herself was standing guard like some kind of suburban sentry, wearing a hard hat that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. When Agent Brooks tried to explain that NTSB investigators had federal authority to access crash sites and my security team presented White House credentials, Vivian just smiled sweetly and handed them a laminated card explaining HOA emergency protocols. "I understand your position, Agent Brooks," Vivian said in that condescending tone she'd perfected over years of neighborhood meetings. "But as the elected representative of this community, I have a responsibility to ensure proper safety measures are in place before allowing potentially dangerous investigative activities." She gestured toward my house like it was some kind of toxic waste dump. "Mr. Hawk has demonstrated a clear disregard for community standards, and until we can guarantee the safety of our residents, this area remains under HOA quarantine." Agent Brooks looked like she was about to explode, but Vivian was already walking away, probably heading to her next performance. I watched from my kitchen window as the NTSB agent spent 20 minutes on her phone, clearly trying to figure out how to deal with an HOA president who thought she outranked federal investigators and White House officials. "Sir," one of my security team members said, "we need to inform the president about this obstruction. This crash site contains prototype communication equipment that was being transported to a secure facility. It's a matter of highest national security." I nodded, my patience with Vivian wearing dangerously thin. Let's see what the president has to say about a civilian blocking a federal national security investigation. Vivian called an emergency HOA meeting, and the room went silent as I walked in with Agent Brooks and my security detail. She was ready to make her case. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced as I took a seat in the back row, "we are facing an unprecedented threat to our community's safety and property values. The reckless actions of one individual have brought federal investigators to our peaceful neighborhood, and we must take immediate action to protect ourselves." She painted me as a villain, a chaotic force who was always causing trouble. But what she didn't count on was the crack in her perfect facade. As she riled up the crowd, I could see it, a crack in their trust. Her words, once filled with power, now seemed more like desperate attempts to salvage what little control she had left. I wasn't the only one who saw through her act. The tide was slowly turning. She pulled out a folder full of photographs showing the crash site, the emergency vehicles, and even a shot of me in handcuffs from the day before. "This is what happens," she declared, holding up the photo of my arrest, "when we allow individuals to operate outside the bounds of community oversight. Mr. Hawk's property has become a liability to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Heights." The crowd was eating it up, nodding along like she was delivering the Gettysburg Address instead of a character assassination. The real kicker came when she announced that the HOA board had voted to impose a $5,000 fine on me for creating a public safety hazard and violating emergency response protocols. She slid an official-looking document across the table, complete with letterhead and what appeared to be multiple signatures from board members. Furthermore, she continued, her voice rising to a dramatic crescendo, until Mr. Hawk demonstrates compliance with community standards and pays the assessed fine, access to his property will remain restricted to protect the safety and well-being of our residents. I felt my hands clench into fists under the table, and it took every ounce of self-control I had not to stand up and tell the whole room exactly what I thought of their fake fine and manufactured emergency. When the meeting opened for community input, my legs felt heavy as I stood, but I had no choice. Every eye in the room was locked on me now, a sea of hostile gazes and whispered judgments. I could feel the pressure building, the air thick with expectation. It was a game of nerves, and my heart was pounding in my chest. If I didn't make this count, Vivienne would win. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, keeping my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "I want you to know that everything you've heard tonight is a complete fabrication, designed to cover up the fact that your HOA president prevented emergency responders from reaching a plane crash site." The room erupted in murmurs, but Vivienne was already shaking her head with that patronizing smile she'd perfected. "Mr. Hawk, your attempts to deflect blame onto the very people trying to protect this community are both predictable and pathetic. We have documentation, witness statements, and photographic evidence of your actions." She was good, I had to give her that. She'd managed to twist the entire situation so thoroughly that even I was starting to sound like the bad guy. But I wasn't going down without a fight. "Since we're talking about documentation," I said, pulling out my phone, "let me show everyone what really happened yesterday morning." I'd spent the previous evening reviewing my security camera footage, and what I'd found was going to change everything. The video clearly showed Vivienne approaching my gate with the padlock already in her possession, checking her watch like she was timing her arrival, and then deliberately securing the gate just minutes before the fire department arrived. "This footage," I announced to the stunned room, "shows your HOA president committing what amounts to obstruction of emergency services. The question you should be asking yourselves is why she had that lock ready to go, and why she was more concerned with playing power games than with letting firefighters do their job." I saw a flash of fear in Vivienne's eyes before it disappeared. For the first time, I felt hope. She was unraveling. "Mr. Hawk, I'm disappointed," she said with that calm, calculating tone. But there was an edge now, an uncertainty I hadn't seen before. The crowd's eyes weren't on me anymore, they were on her, and for the first time I could hear the whispers. "She's not so untouchable after all," one neighbor muttered, and I knew we were finally winning. I decided it was time to reveal who I really was. What Mrs. Brooks doesn't know, or has chosen to ignore, is that I serve as the Deputy White House Chief of Staff for National Security Affairs. I pulled out my government credentials and held them up. That plane contains sensitive equipment critical to our national security, and by preventing federal investigators from accessing the site, Mrs. Brooks has potentially committed a federal offense. A hush fell over the room as I continued. "I've been authorized by the President himself to oversee this investigation, and anyone who continues to obstruct it will face severe consequences. The HOA board will be requesting a full forensic analysis of any so-called footage you claim to possess and verification of those alleged credentials," Vivienne replied, her voice slightly less confident. She turned to address the crowd directly. "This is exactly the kind of desperate behavior we've come to expect from individuals who refuse to accept responsibility for their actions. I encourage everyone to remember that digital evidence can be easily manipulated by those with the technical knowledge and moral flexibility to do so." With that, she gathered her papers and walked out of the room, leaving me standing at the front, facing a crowd of neighbors who looked more confused than convinced. Reed caught up with me in the parking lot after the meeting, and he looked troubled. "Dylan, she's got most of them believing her version of the story. That footage might be your ace in the hole, but she's already planted the seed that it could be fake." He lit a cigarette and took a long drag before continuing. "There's something else you should know. I did some digging into Vivienne's background, and this isn't the first time she's pulled something like this. 3 years ago, she tried to get the fire department banned from responding to calls in the neighborhood because they were disrupting the peace with their sirens. The fire chief told her exactly where she could stick her complaint, but it shows you what kind of person we're dealing with. As we stood there in the empty parking lot, I realized that I was going to need more than security footage and White House credentials to take down Vivienne Brooks. I was going to need a strategy. Reed, I need your help, I said, lowering my voice. The plane that crashed isn't just any aircraft. It was transporting specialized communication equipment for the White House. I can't go into details, but it's crucial that we secure that wreckage immediately. If Vivian continues to obstruct the investigation, she could be compromising national security. Reed nodded solemnly. You can count on me. What's the plan? 3 days after the community meeting, I was having my morning coffee when I spotted a group of teenagers in my back pasture, right near the crash site. I immediately called Agent Brooks to report the tampering, but she was already aware of the situation. Mr. Hawk, I'm going to be straight with you, she said, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. We've been dealing with interference on this case from day one, and it's starting to look like a coordinated effort to obstruct our investigation. Someone called the local news station this morning claiming that you've been systematically destroying evidence to cover up your role in causing the crash. The accusation was so ridiculous that I actually laughed out loud, but Agent Brooks wasn't finding any humor in the situation. The problem is, these kinds of allegations can seriously damage an investigation, even when they're completely baseless. We need to wrap this up quickly before the situation gets any more complicated. I understand, I replied, my White House crisis management training kicking in. We need to handle this delicately. The equipment in that plane is classified. We can't afford to have civilians poking around it or news crews broadcasting images that could compromise security. A reporter arrived shortly after, questioning me about the allegations of evidence tampering. Someone had tipped off the press, claiming I was covering up the crash. I showed her the footage of Vivian's crew removing wreckage, leaving her stunned. This is interesting, she said, reviewing the video on her camera, but we've also received sworn statements from 3 community members claiming they witnessed you acting suspiciously around the crash site. When she showed me the statements, I recognized Vivian's influence immediately. All 3 witnesses were HOA board members. What the statements don't mention, I said carefully, is that I've been authorized by the president to oversee this investigation due to the sensitive nature of the aircraft's cargo. I can't disclose details, but I can tell you that this isn't just about a private plane crash. It's a matter of national security. The reporter's eyes widened. Are you saying this is a government aircraft? I'm saying this investigation falls under federal jurisdiction, and anyone interfering with it is potentially violating national security protocols, I responded, choosing my words carefully to avoid revealing classified information. That evening's news broadcast was a masterpiece of character assassination, disguised as objective reporting. The story led with dramatic footage of the crash site, followed by official-sounding statements about ongoing federal investigations and allegations of evidence tampering. They interviewed Vivienne, who appeared on camera wearing her most concerned citizen expression and speaking in carefully measured tones about community safety and the importance of cooperation with federal authorities. When they mentioned my name, it was always in connection with words like allegations, suspicious behavior, and ongoing investigation. By the time they got to my side of the story, I came across as defensive and evasive, despite having concrete evidence of Vivian's actual wrongdoing. They completely omitted any mention of my White House position or the national security implications of the crash. The next morning brought an emergency HOA board meeting, and this time I wasn't just uninvited, I was explicitly banned from attending. Reed managed to sneak me a recording of the proceedings, and what I heard made my blood run cold. Vivian had convinced the board that I was not only a danger to the community but potentially a federal fugitive trying to cover up criminal activity. Given the serious nature of these allegations, her voice came through clear on Reed's phone recording. The board has voted unanimously to implement emergency measures for the protection of our residents. Effective immediately, Mr. Hawk is prohibited from any HOA-sponsored activities. His property access is restricted to essential services only, and we are formally requesting law enforcement intervention to ensure community safety. She'd managed to essentially place me under house arrest in my own neighborhood. But Vivian had made one crucial mistake. She'd gotten greedy. In her rush to destroy my reputation, she'd overplayed her hand with the evidence tampering story. I spent that afternoon carefully reviewing every frame of my security footage, and what I found was going to be her undoing. The cameras had captured not just the teenagers removing debris, but also Vivian herself, meeting with them beforehand, handing over what looked like cash and pointing out specific pieces of wreckage for them to target. Even better, the audio system had picked up part of their conversation, including Vivian's voice clearly saying, "Make sure you get those electronic components. Those are the ones that will cause the most problems for the investigation." I immediately contacted the White House. "Sir," said my assistant, "the president wants to know if we should send in federal agents to secure the crash site immediately." "Not yet," I replied. "If we bring in a federal team now, Vivienne will use it to further her narrative that I'm hiding something. We need to expose her publicly first, then secure the site. I have a plan." That weekend's HOA meeting was packed, with neighbors spilling out into the hallway and folding chairs set up in every available space. Vivienne had billed it as a community safety forum, but everyone knew it was really about me. She'd prepared an elaborate presentation, complete with charts, graphs, and what appeared to be official documentation from various government agencies. For the first 20 minutes, she held the crowd spellbound with tales of federal investigations, property devaluations, and the various dangers posed by uncooperative residents. She'd even brought in a so-called expert on aviation safety who testified about the importance of preserving crash sites and the serious federal penalties for evidence tampering. When she finally opened the floor for questions, I stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room, carrying a small portable projector I'd borrowed from Reed. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, setting up my equipment while Vivienne watched nervously from the podium. "I appreciate Mrs. Brooks' concern for aviation safety and evidence preservation. In fact, I share those concerns so strongly that I've prepared a little video presentation of my own." The projector hummed to life, casting a bright rectangle of light on the wall behind me. This footage, taken from my security system over the past week, shows exactly who has been tampering with evidence at the crash site. The room fell silent as the video began to play, showing Vivienne's clandestine meeting with the cleanup crew in crystal clear detail. The room erupted as Vivienne's lies were exposed, and the crowd quickly turned on her. The audio was particularly damning, as her voice came through loud and clear as she instructed the teenagers to make it look like natural scavenging and to focus on the pieces that would be most important to investigators. When the video ended, the room erupted in angry voices, with people demanding explanations and shouting questions that Vivienne couldn't possibly answer. She tried to claim the footage was fabricated, but Reed had already shared copies with several tech-savvy neighbors who could verify its authenticity. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I watched Vivienne Brooks lose control of a room full of people, and it was beautiful. "There's one more thing you all should know," I said, pulling out my White House credentials. "I am the Deputy White House Chief of Staff for National Security Affairs. The aircraft that crashed on my property was carrying classified equipment vital to our national security. By tampering with the wreckage and obstructing federal investigators, Mrs. Brooks hasn't just broken local laws, she's potentially committed federal crimes that carry serious penalties." The room went completely silent as I continued. "I've been authorized by the president to oversee this investigation personally, and I can assure you that anyone who continues to interfere will face the full weight of federal prosecution." After the security footage revelation, you'd think Vivienne would have backed down or at least tried to make amends, but I seriously underestimated her capacity for manipulation. Vivienne turned the tables, claiming I had threatened her at the meeting. With a bandaged wrist and tearful eyes, she spun her version of events, completely ignoring the dozen witnesses who had seen me leave alone. She'd also managed to get 3 of her closest HOA allies to corroborate her story, each adding their own embellishments about my supposedly threatening behavior. Mrs. Patterson from Elm Street claimed she'd heard me shouting obscenities in the parking lot, while Mr. Chen from the corner house swore he'd seen me following Vivienne to her car in what he described as a menacing manner. The fact that none of these witnesses had mentioned anything about threatening behavior until Vivienne coached them was conveniently overlooked by most of the neighborhood. By the time she was finished with her presentation, complete with photos of her injuries and written statements from her supporters, she'd managed to transform herself from the villain caught red-handed tampering with evidence into a brave community leader standing up to a dangerous bully. "Furthermore," she added dramatically, "I've received information suggesting that Mr. Hawk's claims about working for the White House may be fabricated. We've contacted the White House press office, and they were unable to verify his employment." This was a clever move. She knew the press office wouldn't confirm the identity of national security personnel to random callers. The community response was swift. Within a week, I was completely ostracized. Grocery deliveries stopped, my mail was abandoned at the driveway, and even my favorite pizza place stopped delivering. The isolation was deliberate and systematic. Vivienne had turned my own neighbors into a network of informants and enforcers, all convinced they were protecting themselves from a dangerous individual. The worst part was seeing parents pulling their children away when I tried to wave hello during my morning walks, their faces filled with genuine fear that Vivienne had carefully cultivated. Meanwhile, the NTSB investigation had ground to a complete halt thanks to Vivian's latest tactic. She'd organized what she called a community safety patrol that positioned volunteers around my property 24 hours a day, ostensibly to monitor for suspicious activity, but actually to prevent Agent Brooks from conducting her investigation. Every time the federal investigators tried to access the crash site, they were met by a small crowd of concerned citizens with cell phones and clipboards, ready to document any aggressive behavior or safety violations. Vivian had effectively weaponized the entire neighborhood against both me and the federal investigation, creating a situation where law enforcement couldn't distinguish between legitimate community concerns and orchestrated obstruction. Agent Brooks was reaching the end of her patience with the whole situation. "Mr. Hawk, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what your HOA president is pulling," she told me during one of our increasingly frustrating phone conversations. "We've got eyewitness accounts of evidence tampering, recordings of obstruction, and clear documentation of interference with a federal investigation, but every time we move to take action, she floods us with complaints about your supposed threatening behavior. My supervisors are starting to wonder if this whole thing is just a neighborhood dispute that's gotten out of hand." The implication was clear. If Vivian could muddy the waters enough, she might actually succeed in getting the investigation transferred to another team, or even suspended entirely. "Agent Brooks," I said firmly, "this is much more than a neighborhood dispute. The aircraft contained prototype communication equipment developed for the White House. If that technology falls into the wrong hands, it could compromise our entire national security infrastructure. I'm going to contact the president directly and request intervention from federal marshals." By Thursday, the pressure had worn me down. The constant surveillance and isolation made me question if fighting Vivian was even worth it. Reed had stopped by earlier with groceries and a concerned expression, but even his friendship felt strained under the weight of neighborhood pressure. "Dylan, I believe you completely. But my wife is getting phone calls from other neighbors asking why we're still associating with you," he'd admitted. "The HOA board is talking about imposing fines on anyone who provides you with material support, whatever that means." That evening, as I sat on my porch watching Vivian's safety patrol volunteers, taking notes on my every movement, something inside me finally snapped. I'd spent my entire career in public service, fighting for justice and protecting the nation's security. I'd advised presidents, coordinated national security operations, and faced down international crises with a clear head and steady hand. I'd come to this ranch specifically to get away from the politics and stress of Washington, only to find myself facing an even more twisted version of the same problems. But this time, I wasn't constrained by diplomatic niceties or bureaucratic red tape. This time, I could fight back using every tool and technique I'd learned during years of high-stakes political maneuvering. I spent that night going through every piece of evidence I'd collected, every recording Reed had made, and every photograph my security system had captured. What I found was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond simple HOA power games. Vivian had been systematically abusing her position for years, using intimidation, manufactured crises, and social manipulation to control her neighbors and eliminate anyone who threatened her authority. The plane crash hadn't created a monster. It had simply given an existing monster a bigger stage to perform on. As I organized my evidence into a comprehensive case file, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my own reputation anymore. I was fighting to expose a predator who had been terrorizing an entire community under the guise of civic responsibility. By morning, I had a plan that would either completely vindicate me or destroy what remained of my life in Meadowbrook Heights. Agent Brooks had mentioned during one of our conversations that the NTSB was required to hold a public hearing if community interference reached a certain threshold. And Vivian's orchestrated obstruction had definitely crossed that line. But more importantly, I'd discovered that Vivian had been falsifying HOA documents for years, including the signatures on my $5,000 fine and several other emergency measures that had never actually been voted on by the board. She'd gotten so comfortable with her manipulations that she'd stopped being careful about covering her tracks. All I needed was the right opportunity to expose her lies in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. That opportunity was coming sooner than I expected. I made a secure call to the White House. "Sir," I told the president, "I need your authorization for something unconventional." The opportunity I'd been waiting for came in the form of another emergency community meeting, this one called by Vivian herself to address what she termed escalating safety concerns and the need for enhanced protective measures. She'd been building toward this moment for weeks, laying the groundwork for what I suspected would be her final move, to have me forcibly removed from the neighborhood. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening at the clubhouse, and from the buzz around the community, it was clear that this was being billed as the decisive confrontation between Vivian's vision of community safety and my alleged reign of terror. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the entire week preparing my own presentation, one that would turn her carefully constructed narrative inside out. I arrived at the meeting 30 minutes early, dressed in my best suit and carrying a briefcase that contained enough evidence to bury Vivian's reputation so deep it would never see daylight again. The room was packed beyond capacity, with neighbors standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. I could see local news cameras set up in the back, and I recognized several faces from previous meetings who looked like they were expecting some kind of gladiatorial combat. Vivian was holding court at the front of the room, surrounded by her inner circle of HOA board members and looking more confident than I'd seen her since this whole ordeal began. She was wearing a sharp navy blue suit and had styled her hair in a way that made her look both professional and sympathetic, the perfect combination for her. When the meeting officially began, Vivian launched into what could only be described as a masterpiece of theatrical manipulation. She'd prepared a slide presentation that chronicled what she called 6 weeks of escalating threats and intimidation tactics designed to undermine community safety and obstruct legitimate governance. She had charts, photographs of my property, and even testimonial videos from neighbors describing their fear and anxiety about living near someone with my demonstrated pattern of aggressive behavior. It was a comprehensive character assassination disguised as a community safety briefing. The climax of her presentation came when she introduced what she claimed was definitive proof of my involvement in evidence tampering. She'd somehow obtained what appeared to be official documentation from the NTSB stating that crucial components from the crashed aircraft had been deliberately compromised or removed from the crash site, and that their investigation had identified me as the primary person of interest in the tampering case. The room erupted in gasps and angry murmurs as she held up the official-looking documents, her voice rising to a dramatic crescendo as she declared, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not dealing with a difficult neighbor. We are dealing with someone who has committed federal crimes to cover up his own negligence, and who continues to threaten anyone who dares to expose his actions." But I'd been expecting something like this, and I was ready. As Vivian basked in the shocked reactions of the crowd, I stood up slowly and began walking toward the front of the room. "Mrs. Brooks," I said in a calm, clear voice that cut through the chaos, "those are very serious allegations. I'm sure everyone here would be interested to know where you obtained those NTSB documents." She tried to deflect, claiming that the source was less important than its content, but I pressed forward. "Actually, the source is extremely important because those documents don't exist. Agent Isla Brooks has never identified me as a person of interest, and the agency has never issued any statements about evidence tampering in this case. What you're holding are forgeries." The word forgeries hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode, and I watched Vivian's confident expression begin to crack around the edges. "Mr. Hawk, your desperate attempts to discredit legitimate evidence only prove how dangerous you've become," she replied, but her voice had lost some of its theatrical authority. "These documents speak for themselves." That's when I pulled out my phone and placed a call that I'd set up in advance. "Agent Brooks, could you please confirm for this room that you've never identified me as a person of interest and that the NTSB has never issued any public statements about evidence tampering in the Meadowbrook Heights crash investigation?" Agent Brooks's voice came through the phone speaker clearly, confirming exactly what I'd claimed and adding that anyone falsifying federal documents could face serious criminal charges. The room fell silent as the implications sank in, but I wasn't finished. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder containing copies of every forged document, falsified signature, and fabricated piece of evidence that Vivian had produced over the past 6 weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've just witnessed is the latest in a pattern of deception that goes back years. Mrs. Brooks has been falsifying HOA documents, manufacturing evidence, and manipulating community meetings to maintain her position of power. I began distributing copies of the evidence to neighbors throughout the room, watching their expressions change from confusion to shock to anger as they realized the extent of Vivian's deceptions. "But there's more," I continued, signaling to the back of the room. The doors opened, and in walked a man in a perfectly tailored suit, flanked by 2 Secret Service agents. The room fell completely silent as the President of the United States strode to the front of the room. "Good evening," he said with that familiar voice that had addressed the nation countless times. "I don't normally attend homeowners association meetings, but when one of my most trusted advisors is being prevented from carrying out a national security mission, I make exceptions." He turned to Vivian, whose face had drained of all color. "Mrs. Brooks, I believe you've been interfering with a federal investigation into a crashed aircraft containing classified technology. That's not just an HOA violation, that's a federal crime." The final blow came when I played the audio recording that Reed had made of Vivian's conversation with the teenage cleanup crew. Her voice filled the room, clearly instructing them to remove specific pieces of evidence and to make it look natural. But the most damaging part was what came next. A portion of the recording that I'd enhanced and cleaned up, where Vivian could be heard laughing about how easy it is to manipulate these idiots, and describing her neighbors as sheep who will believe anything if you package it with enough official-looking paperwork. The sound of her own words describing her contempt for the very people she claimed to represent was like a dagger through the heart of her carefully constructed image. The community's reaction was swift and brutal. Neighbors who had been defending Vivian minutes earlier were now demanding her immediate resignation. The HOA board members who had been sitting beside her began distancing themselves, claiming they had been misled and manipulated, just like everyone else. Someone in the crowd called for an immediate vote of no confidence, and within 30 minutes Vivian Brooks had been stripped of her position as HOA chairwoman by a margin of 43 votes to 2. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the meeting, she looked directly at me with an expression of pure hatred. "This isn't over," she whispered as she passed my chair. "You have no idea what you've started." But for the first time in weeks, I was smiling. The Queen of Meadowbrook Heights had finally been dethroned. After losing her position as HOA chairwoman, most people would have cut their losses and tried to rebuild their reputation quietly. But Vivian Brooks wasn't most people. She spent the next week in what could only be described as a controlled rage, making phone calls, sending emails, and meeting with anyone who would listen to her revised version of events. According to her new narrative, she had been the victim of an elaborate conspiracy between me, Agent Brooks, and unnamed federal authorities who were trying to cover up the real truth about the plane crash. She claimed that her evidence had been legitimate, and that I had used my connections in the White House to manufacture false recordings and forged documents to discredit her. It was a desperate strategy, but Vivian was a skilled manipulator, and desperate times called for desperate measures. Her plan became clear when Reed called me at 6 a.m. on Tuesday, his voice urgent and worried. "Dylan, you need to get out to your back pasture right now. There are people messing around at the crash site again, but it's not teenagers this time." I threw on some clothes and grabbed my binoculars, then made my way to the back of my property where I could get a clear view of the crash site. What I saw made my blood run cold. Vivian herself was out there in the pre-dawn darkness, wearing dark clothing and carrying what looked like a small sledgehammer. She was systematically destroying the remaining pieces of aircraft debris, smashing them into unrecognizable fragments and scattering the pieces across a wider area. It was evidence tampering on a scale that would make her previous efforts look like. I immediately called Agent Brooks, but as I watched Vivian work, I realized this might be exactly the opportunity I'd been waiting for. She was so focused on her destruction that she hadn't noticed the motion-activated cameras Reed and I had installed around the crash site. Every swing of her hammer was being recorded in high-definition detail. More importantly, I had a feeling this wasn't just about covering her tracks. This was about framing me. If I called the authorities now, she would claim she had caught me tampering. But if I let her finish and revealed the truth later, I could expose her final deception completely. Agent Brooks arrived within the hour, accompanied by 2 other federal investigators and a local sheriff's deputy. By that time, Vivian had completed her work and was nowhere to be seen, but the crash site looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Aircraft components that had been carefully cataloged and preserved were now scattered in tiny pieces across several acres, making any meaningful investigation virtually impossible. "Mr. Hawk," Agent Brooks said, surveying the destruction with a grim expression, "I hope you have a very good explanation for this, because right now you're looking at federal charges for obstruction and evidence tampering." Before I could respond, my phone started ringing with calls from neighbors reporting that they had seen suspicious activity around my property early that morning. That's when Vivian made her entrance, arriving with several HOA board members and neighbors in tow. She was carrying a folder of witness statements. "Agent Brooks, thank goodness you're here," she said, slightly out of breath. "I received calls from neighbors about Mr. Hawk's activities this morning, and when I came to investigate, I found him destroying evidence at the crash site. I tried to stop him, but he became aggressive and threatened me again." She handed over the folder with a theatrical flourish. "These statements from multiple witnesses document his actions and his threats. I believe we finally have the evidence we need to hold him accountable." The federal investigators began reviewing Vivian's statements while I stood there feeling like the walls were closing in around me. Her story was perfect: multiple witnesses, a clear timeline, and physical evidence of tampering that couldn't be denied. If I didn't have the hidden camera footage, I would probably be in handcuffs within the hour. But I did have that footage, and I also had something else that Vivian didn't know about. I'd been live streaming the entire confrontation through a hidden camera system that Reed had helped me set up. Everything that was happening right now was being broadcast in real time to a private channel that several neighbors had access to, including some who were supposed to be Vivian's supporters. "Agent Brooks," I said calmly, "before you make any arrests, I think you should see something." I pulled out my phone and showed her the footage from the early morning with crystal clear images of Vivian systematically destroying evidence while I was still in my house. This video was recorded by motion-activated cameras that were installed around the crash site last week. As you can see, Mrs. Brooks was the only person at the crash site this morning, and she spent approximately 45 minutes destroying every piece of aircraft debris she could find. The agent's expression changed as she watched Vivian's solitary figure moving through the darkness, methodically obliterating evidence with practice. But the real moment of truth came when I revealed the live stream. "Mrs. Brooks, could you please explain to Agent Brooks why you just claimed to have witnessed me tampering with evidence when you were actually the person doing the tampering?" I held up my phone, showing the live feed, which had captured her entire performance from arrival to accusation. This entire conversation has been broadcast live to approximately 30 neighbors, including several members of your former HOA board. They've all watched you lie to federal investigators in real time. The look of shock and horror on Vivian's face as she realized she'd been caught in the act was worth every sleepless night and stressful day of the past 2 months. The federal agents moved quickly once they had the evidence. Vivian was arrested on charges of obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and making false statements to federal investigators. As they led her away in handcuffs, she was still trying to maintain her innocence, claiming that the videos were somehow fabricated and that she was being framed by a conspiracy of federal agents and corrupt neighbors. But her credibility was completely shot, and even her most loyal supporters were backing away from her as the extent of her deceptions became clear. Agent Brooks apologized for doubting me and explained that the NTSB investigation could finally proceed without interference. As I watched the patrol car disappear down my driveway, carrying Vivienne toward what would hopefully be a long overdue appointment with justice, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. 3 weeks later, I was reading the morning paper when I came across an article on page 6. Former HOA president sentenced in federal tampering case. The article detailed Vivian's sentence: 18 months in federal prison, 2 years of probation, and a fine for her interference with the NTSB investigation. Most satisfying was the civil judgment requiring her to pay restitution to neighbors she'd harassed, including $10,000 to me for defamation. Agent Brooks called to confirm that the NTSB investigation was complete. The crash was caused by a faulty fuel pump, not by any actions on my property. Your evidence helped expose Vivian's obstruction, which had been affecting other federal cases, she said. And more importantly, we've secured all the classified technology from the aircraft. The president sends his personal thanks. The neighborhood's transformation since Vivian's arrest had been remarkable to witness. The toxic atmosphere of suspicion and manipulation that had poisoned community relationships for months evaporated almost overnight once people realized how thoroughly they'd been deceived. Neighbors who had avoided me for weeks were stopping by to apologize and to share their own stories of Vivian's manipulation tactics. Mrs. Patterson from Elm Street admitted that Vivian had pressured her into making false statements about my behavior, while Mr. Chen confessed that he'd never actually witnessed any threatening actions, but had been afraid to contradict the HOA chairwoman. The picture that emerged was of an entire community held hostage by one person's need for control and validation. The most satisfying development came when the remaining HOA board members approached me with a proposal that I never could have imagined. "Dylan, We've been talking, and we think the best way to prevent another Vivienne Brooks situation is to dissolve the homeowners association entirely, Reed explained during an impromptu gathering in my living room. We've realized that most of the services the HOA provided were either unnecessary or could be handled more efficiently by the county. The main thing the association did was give people like Vivienne a platform to abuse their neighbors. The proposal required a 2/3 majority vote from all property owners in the development, but given recent events, support was overwhelming. Within a month, Meadowbrook Heights became one of the few developments in the county to successfully dissolve its homeowners association. As I walked around my property that evening, checking on the horses and enjoying the peaceful silence that had returned to my life, I reflected on the lessons learned from this bizarre experience. Vivienne Brooks had been a master manipulator who understood how to weaponize people's fears and prejudices to maintain control. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She targeted someone who had spent years navigating the complex world of White House politics and national security. Her downfall hadn't come from some dramatic confrontation or brilliant legal strategy. It had come from patient documentation, careful planning, and the willingness to let her reveal her true nature when she thought nobody was watching. The whole experience had also taught me something important about community dynamics and the power of manufactured authority. Vivienne hadn't been elected to her position through any democratic process. She'd simply declared herself the leader and convinced everyone else to go along with it. Once people accepted her authority, they'd been willing to overlook increasingly irrational behavior because challenging a leader requires more courage than most people possess. It was a sobering reminder that the price of freedom really is eternal vigilance, whether you're dealing with corrupt politicians or power-hungry HOA presidents. 6 months after Vivienne's sentencing, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in what I recognized as Vivienne's distinctive handwriting. "You may have won this battle, but you haven't won the war. I know where you live, and I have a long memory. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." I stared at the letter for a moment, then walked over to my garbage can and dropped it inside without a second thought. Vivienne Brooks had spent so much time and energy trying to control other people that she'd never learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best response to a threat is to refuse to be threatened. She was locked up, discredited, and financially ruined, while I was free to enjoy my ranch and my life without looking over my shoulder. As I tell you this story, it's been almost a year since the plane crashed in my pasture, and life in Meadowbrook Heights has returned to the peaceful normalcy that originally attracted me to this place. The crash site has been completely cleaned up and reseeded, and my horses graze there now like nothing ever happened. Reed and I have become closer friends through the ordeal, and several other neighbors have become genuine allies rather than just polite acquaintances. Most importantly, I've learned that standing up to bullies, whether they wear badges, business suits, or HOA name tags, is always worth the effort, no matter how difficult the fight might seem. Vivienne Brooks thought she could intimidate and manipulate her way to permanent power, but she discovered that some people simply refused to be intimidated, and that, as they say, made all the difference.